Victor, evening to you. Thank you for coming in. So when you got the news that Robert Mugabe had now passed 2 years or so since he was removed as Zimbabwe's president, what were your immediate reflections?
It's almost sad. You know, when somebody dies, human beings get sad. I'm sure even your worst enemy, you will know. Because maybe we are all connected as spirits. But then you immediately switch on to, goodness gracious, did he have to leave this? So my own personal connection with Robert Mugabe as a president was in the 80s, in the late 70s. As a kid in Limpopo, we used to sing some of the Pamberenga Chemoranga. We didn't even know what that meant, but we knew that Robert Mugabe was there struggling for freedom in Zimbabwe. So when he became president in 1980, prime minister then, we saw an African icon. So you know what it feels like from 1980, watching this icon until 1990 when he started deteriorating into almost, shall I say, a persona non grata. Because look at the last two introduction links you make. One, he died in a Singaporean hospital. That's scandalous for somebody who ran a country for nearly 40 years to not have built a hospital fit enough to serve a president or former head of state. Number two, ousted in a military coup. As the founding father of an independent and free Zimbabwe, did he have to stick around until he was ousted in a coup? That's the legacy. But look at what Zimbabwe has been. Before he went rogue, if I may use the word, he had built the best education system on the African continent. Zimbabwe still, I think, is in the top 5 with regard to literacy. And the work ethic of Zimbabweans is second to none. The pride of Zimbabweans. He had built a respectable education system. And if you're talking about a developing economy, Tembekile, education, healthcare are two of the most important cornerstones. Because a healthy nation that's literate can build an economy. So he had done well until, of course, he fell on this pothole. And I say the pothole because I'm sure that it was not just President Mugabe's problem that land reform went the way it did. Lancaster House Agreement had a provision that the British would fund the land reform. So I think I would say he slept on the job. He didn't push it hard enough in the first 10 years. He went on a honeymoon, and by the time he realized that maybe the Brits don't mean to fund this land reform, he then took the wrong methods. Of course, he was surrounded by the wrong people, and he went rogue, as I thought.
I want to go back to that period of prosperity, because it was in the 80s when Mugabe and that group of first independence leaders took power in Zimbabwe. At that time, the country was dubbed Africa's breadbasket.
Yes.
You just mentioned the great education system. Healthcare was also coming along quite well. How was he able to do it at a time when the country was essentially coming out of a period of great oppression, what had been a violent freeing, if you will, of Zimbabweans from the shackles of the oppressor?
It shows you that no peasant has ever really led a revolution, if you think about it. The people who led the revolution in Zimbabwe were very well-educated people, and to his credit, President Mugabe did not, as they say, throw out the baby with the bathwater. So he said, we had the links to the O-levels in the UK. Although they're a former colonial master, I'm sure he said, whatever good can come out of it, I'm going to sustain and I'm going to build on. And to date, Zimbabweans are mad about their O-levels. So he showed that he was a sensible leader, because he said, if something is working, why disrupt it? But he was able to just build on that. Zimbabwe schools are not flashy in terms of structure and buildings, but they are producing the quality and the work ethic that we know Zimbabweans for. The people like Strive Masiyiwa, the Trevor Ngubes and the Sfiso Tabengwas, they are all intelligent people who know what to do. Peter Moyo is another. And they are very intelligent people with a work ethic, very literate, and quite decent people, very respectful but proud at the same time.
Limpopo, where you say you first interacted with the history of Zimbabwe and grew up, became one of the first areas, along with the economic centers like Gauteng, to begin to experience that influx of Zimbabweans when things began to go wrong. What was your earliest understanding of what was going on in our northern neighbor as these Zimbabweans began to arrive in areas like Limpopo? I was reading a tweet earlier from someone who grew up around Nzelele, I believe is the name of the area, who said families in Limpopo began adopting Zimbabweans so they could register them with Home Affairs as part of who they were just so they could survive.
Yeah, I'm a bit further south from Njerere. That's Venda. The Njerere is part of Venda, so it's much closer to the border. I'm about maybe 500 kilometers from the border with Zimbabwe. But still, even during the struggle days, there were Zimbabweans living in my village. And you're right. It started as traders. You know, it started as teachers came first, I think, and traders. And then people who were consultants of sorts, and then doctors started moving in. And most of the people who came in were doing it almost in anticipation of things going wrong. They were not desperate. It was only maybe towards 2000 that it started showing the desperation of now this is now when people came in the construction, lowly paying work, and as you know, they disrupted the job market in South Africa because their work ethic just set them apart ahead from the South Africans, but also because they are exploited, they are paid less, the employers tend to prefer them, and that's what you see today overflowing or flaring up in the form of the anger of the unemployed South Africans blaming their misfortune, economic misfortunes on foreigners, which is wrong, but it's not hard to understand.
You're a man about town as far as business is concerned. You know what is going on with the economy in Zimbabwe. Inflation is through the roof. Yeah. Unemployment, there's a public service crisis. Hospitals are in disarray, as well as the education system. No jobs. People continue to migrate to South Africa and elsewhere. What is it going to take to bring the country back from this disaster?
In fact, I was in Zimbabwe in June, and this weekend I was with professionals in the accounting field at Sun City from Zimbabwe. It's going to take Zimbabweans reimagining their country. Number two, it's going to take the current leadership. Maybe if you look at President Mnangagwa, like him or hate him, being able to enlist the support of all Zimbabweans. In other words, becoming a unifying figure. Avoiding being a ZANU-PF president, be a unifying figure, but it's going to take Zimbabweans reimagining a future. Zimbabwe has a lot of young people who are educated, and interestingly, Tembekile, in my last 2-3 visits to Zimbabwe in the past 18 months, I found they have left Australia, they have left London, they have left New York, because they see something in the country that is likely to happen. At the moment, you are right, I remember long queues for fuel when I was there in June, so it's not yet uhuru in that sense of the word, but I can tell you what, the work ethic of Zimbabweans will prevail as long as they can unite around rebuilding this country, and particularly use this disaster, the birth of former President Robert Mugabe, to say, guys, whatever we had happened, the future now depends on us. There's no more Robert Mugabe to blame. And even if we did, he wouldn't be able to fix anything. He was way too old. He left not of his own volition. It's going to take that kind of reimagining. But it's going to take regional integration, SADC coming through and chipping in, and the global community not being as belligerent that it's been with the sanctions that are necessary.
Is the removal then of the sanctions the key to bringing Zimbabwe back as far as investment and trade is concerned?
It's a no-brainer, but it's not going to be as big a deal as SADC integrating, because remember, the bigger trade Zimbabwe is doing is still with the neighboring African countries. It's not necessarily with the rest of the world. But remember, because of the global economy that we are in, having sanctions, even if it's targeted, you are president, we're targeting you, it's that you are unable to move to certain places, it just disrupts that kind of reimagining and reconfiguring of the economy.
You travel to Zimbabwe a lot. The Zimbabweans that you've spoken to post the toppling of Mugabe's regime in 2017, do they feel that that moment in their history was worth it?
It was pivotal, it was worth it, but again, the impatience of having been there 20 years of waiting, some of them I find are a little unrealistic in what they expect. I don't blame them, but I think they're going to have to understand they toppled the man, they must rebuild. Toppling is one thing, rebuilding is another.
And how do they remember Robert Mugabe?
It's mixed, I must be honest. But remember, again, the human side, he's always going to be the founding father. So even those who hated his politics, his tactics, those who would have suffered in Matabeleland cannot deny the fact that he made a contribution. He went rogue, as I say, on them with the massacre and, of course, with the mismanagement of the economy and failing to keep Zimbabwe in the game. So it's mixed feelings, but in the end, they are mindful. It's like having a grandfather who's swearing at you every day. You keep feeding them, but they annoy you, and then you realize, but this is my pedigree, it's my heritage, there's no way you can divorce. So they can't divorce the icon that he was, but I'm sure they will always have the scars of the mistakes he made later in his career.
Victor Khumeswana, thank you so much for coming in tonight.
Been a pleasure.